Hi there, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Aristotle's Politics. We are now today going to do chapter 7 of book 5. Yesterday, in the last episode that you had, we dealt with oligarchies, changes in oligarchies. This is the last section of the discussion of the different variations of revolution or metobole, the forms that do it. And the next chapter, chapter 8 and 9, will deal with the question of what can you do to preserve a regime. Um, Now, in 7, we're dealing with, he dealt with in 5 and 6. 5 was democracy, it's very short. 6 was a very long chapter. 7 is going to be long but shorter than 6. And it's going to be dealing with. This is what's interesting. It's regimes and what do you call it? Um, the regimes that are left over, right? The regimes that are left over, we understand in book 4. Um, Other than he says, we have 6 regimes apparently, and remember the 6 regimes: kingship, tyranny, aristocracy, oligarchy, polity, or which is politeia, regime, the name regime called regime, and democracy. Right. He then says, okay, that typology, the six-fold typology, is gone. He redefines it in chapter 4, book 4, chapter 2, to go on another direction. And starting with chapter 3, we get a new account of a regime. Now, this is a double-fold regime. That regime is not only between types, but within type change. But then in this account, what happens is that there is 4 regimes, including tyranny, 5 left. Um, that is, kingship will not be addressed per se. Tyranny was in book chapter 10 of book 4, but it's weird in 4 because you get this ordering of first democracy and oligarchy treated separately, then so-called so-called um, aristocracy, which is interesting. He's talking about aristocracy, so-called aristocracy, and polity. Both of these are kind of hybrid forms. One is more popular, polity, or so-called the regime called regime. This is more popular, and aristocracy is kind of more like rule of the few, oligarchy. But it's different. It's mostly also mixed. These regimes will have what he says, they'll be blended in that sense. But all regimes are kind of blended. Oligarchy and democracy seems to be, the argument is that these are more pure. These regimes are kind of more pure, whatever, in that they're rule of the people or rule of the rich. So-called aristocracy is more kind of rule of the educated or the better off, the maybe the more virtuous, or what. And that's kind of weird because there's no order. We're in book 4. There was an order. Then what happens with democracy, oligarchy? There's a nice clear pattern, and then there's 3 chapters. You figure the pattern would happen, but rather in book 4, there's always this mixing up and intersecting of any discussion of the politeia called politeia and so-called um, aristocracy. Now, this is not aristocracy in the sense that is discussed in book 7 and 8, the regime that we would pray for, but rather a kind of defective, or what people hold to be uh, 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 aristocracy, the kind of aristocracy as we see it in the world, not the aristocracy that we would pray for, but rather the aristocracy we get in of the bettering sort of no this it's oligarchic character of a rule of the few, but it's tied to some kind of aspect of education. Um, and that's a good thing to think about the structure. In other words, there's something confused, mixed. It is completely blurred in the 3 chapters there. In fact, that's interesting because then we get tyranny by itself, a small little chapter, and then we get the discussion of the regime that would best suit all things, and it's discussion of the mixed, about the problem of blending and preserving the regimes and the idea of the middling sort. He doesn't really talk about the middling sort in the discussion in book 4, chapter 7, 8, 9 per se. He hints at it, but he speaks of those that are heavily armed. There was this idea. Now here he starts off right away in chapter 7 on the question of aristocracies. Right? Let's look at this. Right? Let's go read it. Let's go spend our time. I kind of reviewed some things so that you get a context. We have the context here. He says aristocracies. In aristocracies, now aristocracy, let's say so-called aristocracies, factional conflict, whoa, stasis arises on the one hand on account of there being few who partake in the prerogatives, which was said to be what affects change in oligarchies as well. This is because aristocracy, too, is in some sense an oligarchy. In both, the rulers are few, and though it is not on account of the same thing that they're few, aristocracy too is at any rate held to be sort of an oligarchy on account of these things. That's the word few is the word olach. Okay, that's where oligarchy comes from. So, but he's insisted that oligarchy does not mean the fewness; it means wealth, right? Earlier, in that sense, that this idea of wealth or the rule of the wealthy, the rule of the well-off, right? Here he's saying the aristocracy here is not an aristocracy in that they're the rule of the best, literally Aristotle's best cracy rule. Aristocracy means literally best rulers, rule of the best. Okay, um, uh, um, these are not the regime of the best ones that are talked about in book 7, the one that's the regime that we would pray for, but rather these are the regimes that we have amongst us. So therefore, he says that what's interesting is that it's like aristocracy, it's similar to aristocracy, in that the rulers are few. So go back to the original few one, few many, right? Of the typology which was originally something accidental in book 3 is now is not so accidental. That the question of whether that's the rule of the few and the rule of the many, this may be a very fundamental question, the few and the many. As he said, the two themes in book 4. He'll say this in book I think chapter 3. The pairs of two of the winds of the rhythms. Here we have the two themes of the few and the many, which dominate the nature of politics. And if the pure forms of the few and the many is democracy and oligarchy, these more blended forms are going to be politeia and so-called aristocracy. Right? Politeia is a popular rule; it's many, not few. Where aristocracy is few. And why does it? And again, he says that there is conflict here because they're few. Right? It's because they're few. And therefore they get the same problem that aristocracy, oligarchy has. So-called aristocracy will have as well. Okay, on account of these things. Now, paragraph 2. This necessary results, above all, where there is a certain multitude of persons who presume themselves to be similar on the basis of virtue, as, for example, the so-called Patari at Sparta, who came from the peers, and when discovering conspiracy, were sent off by them to Tartum as settlers. Now, at Pataria are various. The Pataria are various, said to have been the illegitimate offsprings of Spartan fathers or Spartan mothers, or disenfranchised citizens of the first time of the First Messenian War in the late 8th century. The peers, the hominoi, literally similar ones, was a term used of the Spartites, the Spartan citizen class. In other words, the people who are the citizen class, the Spartites. In other words, the peers are the ones who are those who are used as the Spartites, who are like this. Now, He's now saying what this aristocracy is necessary one with a certain multitude of persons, a multitude who views them to be similar on account of virtue. Okay? Spartan regime, right? This is the idea. This is the so-called Spartan element. But then, in other words, and he gives the example of this, that of the party at Sparta, who came from the peers, and when they discovered they were sent off to target settlers, right? Or it is results when those who are great and inferior to no one in virtue are dishonored by persons held to be great honor, as Lysander was by the kings, for example. So, in other words, that's another element. There's a conflict here. So, in other words, that there's someone who is this people of virtue like this, and they have been targeted, discovered conspiring, or someone who is great and inferior to no one in virtue is dishonored by those who have great honor, as Lysander was done by the kings. Or when someone of a manly sort does not partake in the prerogatives, such as Cynodon, who instigated the attack on the Spartites at the time of Erigidus. Now, this is a very Lysander was this outstanding Spartan admiral of the final stage of the Peloponnesian Wars, who leads Athens, Sparta to victory, right? And Plutarch's, see Xenophon's account in Book 2 of Helicon and Plutarch's account of Lysander. For the conspiracy of Cleon in 398 BC, see Xenophon's Hellenica, Book 3, Chapter 3, sections 4 through 11, right? These are things. Now, the reference to the Second Mysian War is in second century. Tyreus has good government. Eudomia is extant from the. This is found in the sense of package. The fragments. Tiresias is good government. Eunomia, good governance. Eunomia, well, lawfulness. Right? Nomia means law, but good law, the good law, good ruling. It says good governance, and so why is that note? I read 65. I'm ahead, I think. Yeah, I jumped ahead. Spartites of this example of this. Further, if the result, further it results when some persons are very poor and others are well off, as happens most particularly during wars. Right. This was the result, for instance, in Sparta at the time of the war with Messene. Okay, right? This is clear from the poem of Tacitus called "Good Governments," Eudomia. Persons who were hard pressed on account of the war claimed to merit a redistribution of land. For, okay, they said it. Okay, the law made us hard. Maybe we should have land redistributed. That's why 65 was talked there. Now, next, further, it's a result of those who is great, someone who is great and has the capacity to be yet greater, instigating stasis, factional conflict, in order to become the sole ruler, as Pastorianus, the one who was general during the Persian War, is said to have done in Sparta, or, for example, Hanno in Carthage. Right, this is Pastorianus in 1.1 mentioned it, chapter 110 and book 7, 14. Hanno is probably the Carthage general who fought in Sicily during the elder Dionysius of Syracuse around 400 BC. But this is not certain. Again, I think that's who it's referring to there. That these are people who are great and have potential for being even greater, right? And they seek greatness, right? And either this Paracelsus or Hanno. But both in regimes, politeias, regimes, and aristocracies, but both these things, aristocracies and regimes, are overturned above all through a deviation from the justice in the regime itself. So, what is in other words, the regime itself, the claim of justice it makes that justifies itself? What is it? Once there's a deviation from that justification, that sense of justice, that identifying view of justice, then the regime changes. Okay, that's the whole point. The beginning point in regime is when democracy and oligarchies have not been finally beautifully mixed. And in aristocracy, these things and virtue as well, though above all the though above all the two, I mean the rule of the people and oligarchy. For these are what both polities and most of the so-called aristocracies attempt to mix. So therefore, the problem here is the mixing of the people and oligarchs and the oligarchy and the people, the rule of the people. This is the mixing. This is the blending, right? This is the idea that you give them a say, you give the people the say. A blended regime is one is going to give a say. It's not going to be merely that of the few or that of the people, either one. So therefore, and that what makes aristocracy more is the virtue, right? The virtue of it. But here is that this is what's interesting, that oligarchy, I mean, regime is merely the mixing. And of course, this is what I've always argued, that every regime is mixture, because the city is a composite structure of different parts. And each of these parts are going to incline towards a certain, either the notables are going to, the rich and the notables are going to always incline to the rule of oligarchies, those who are few and those who are many. And therefore, the people, when the people are many, this group segment is many, they will be inclined towards the rule of the people, popular rule. If they are a few and they're powerful, they will incline to what? Oligarchic or aristocratic character. So it's therefore the problem here is that the real difference between so-called polity, i.e., regime called regime, and aristocracy here is that it's more complicated. He argues that it's not only these two things. It's not only oligarch the people and that, but also it's what it requires virtue as well. So it's not been finely mixed of these things and virtue as well. Though above all, in other words, but he means above all the two. So even though virtue is an additional thing, it's not that the virtue becomes the problem. It's the thing that's really the problem is the mixing of this rule of the people and the oligarchy, right? Aristocracies differ in this from what are named as regimes, and it is on account of this that the latter are more lasting than and the former less so. So wait a minute, what is less? So the latter is more lasting and the former less so. The former is the aristocracies. These are not lasting longer. It's that aristocracies differ from this of regimes, and it is on account of this that the latter is more lasting. So therefore, the difference is this is what is the difference? The difference is there's no concern for virtue. That's a weird clause. This is a very weird clause here, and this is what drives some people crazy. Um, um, where is that? That's 7. So yeah, let's look at the Greek for a second. Yeah, so I'm sorry I stopped for that. I just needed to look at something to make sure I was right, and I was right. Um, so it is this problem of here that this idea of so-called aristocrat attempted to mix. Aristocracies differ from what is called polities or regimes, right? On account of the latter of this, that the latter are more lasting and the former less so. For those regimes that incline more towards oligarchy, tend which I term aristocracies. For those inclining more towards the multitude, regimes. Okay, that's it. So therefore, that what really defines the two is not that there's virtue or not. All regimes have some kind of understanding of virtue, but rather what we consider politeas or polities, is translation is that Lord and many of the translators do, but politea called politea, right, is that this is popular. Multitude is towards the multitude, inclined towards the multitude. And those are the few, oligarchy, the few, the rule of the few is the aristocracy, right? Um, and it is on account of this that those of the latter sort are more stable than the former. So again, the regime of a few in other words, the rule of the many is more stable than the rule of the few. This is what's a very interesting point. For the majority is superior, and they are more content as they have equality. So the larger part is superior, and they're more content when they have equality. But those who are well off, if the regime gives them preeminence, seek to act arrogantly and aggrandize themselves. So therefore, the danger, again, this is a great line from Machiavelli. Remember that Machiavelli in Prince, he says, the claim of the great want to do great things, right? Aristotle's saying that those who think they are great or better will what? The wealthy, the powerful, the preeminent, right, are going to what? They are what they will act arrogantly and aggrandize themselves, whereas the people just want to have be left alone. He says, be equal. We're equal. We're fine. They're content. They're not going to be as long as they're left alone. They're and not taken. They're as Machiavelli says, their property and their honor are not touched. They're not act arrogantly towards, right? This is their honor not being touched, is not being not acting arrogantly towards them, not engaging in a hubris on them. No, hubris again. This is that interesting thing in Greek. Hubris is not only arrogance; it's arrogance that are aimed at to belittle the victim, the person targeted against. And this is why this leads to resentment on the people who are targeted by it, and therefore this is why it creates stasis in that sense. This arrogantly and aggrandize themselves. In general, whichever group of the regime, to whichever group the regime inclines, it is in that direction that it is transformed when either it is enabled, in other words, when either is enabled to enhance its position. Polity or politea to the regime, to the rule of the people, and that of aristocracy into oligarchy. Or it is in the opposite direction, when either the preeminent group weakens itself by acting unjustly. And this is a weird note here. This line appears to be dropped out of the text at a point. I have supplied it. What he said, something has been missing here. He adds it here. That in other words, that is aristocracy into rule of the people, when those who are poorer pull the regime around to its opposite on the grounds that they are being treated unjustly. And polities and the oligarchy, regimes into oligarchy, when those who are better off make revolution on the grounds that the only lasting thing is equality based on merit and having one's due. In other words, so therefore you get this change, this regimes that these regimes will be that if either they will go to their, it's like that regime called regime will tend towards that when the people get more power, that become popular rule, democratic, or when the wealthy, the few, become more inclined, they will become more oligarchic in character, go from aristocracy to oligarchy. Or what he will say is that if the aristocrats act unjustly and the poor feels that they're being treated unjustly, that turns it into democracy, the rule of the people, the rule of the people. When the poor pull the regime around to the opposite ground, that they are treated unjustly, and what and polities into oligarchy, or regimes into oligarchy, when the wealthy, um, thinking that they should their wealth merits that they have more say and more power, and having one's due. What has just was just spoken of happened in theory. The office, having originally been highly restricted on the basis of a rather large assessment, there was a shift to a small one, and the large number of officials. But the notables were nevertheless able to acquire between them all the land, contrary to law, for the regime was still oligarchic and allowed them to aggrandize themselves in this way. In other words, what happened here throughout, there was this regime, there was an assessment, there was a change in a large assessment, but then what happened? That there was a shift to a smaller one, okay? And a large number of the board officials, and a large number of boards, there was a shift on this regard, right? There was a shift to make it more polity, right? And what happened was that, but the notables were nevertheless able to acquire all the lands, contrary to law, because the regime was oligarchic and allowed them to grant themselves this way. They were, in other words, they. It's not that the regime was that they were still thinking I'm better than them, I should rule. Okay, this led to stasis and civil war, and with the notables operating from garrison strong points in the country and the people holding the city. But the people who had been trained for war, okay, proved superior to the garrisons, until those having more than their share of the land voluntarily gave it up. Now, 68. This is nothing known about this event at Turley, which is unrelated, which are probably unrelated to mentioned in chapter 312. He follows. Okay, maybe book 312. Sorry. I followed Dernzeider, assuming that Lucana, right? He follows this Dernzeider German edition of Aristotle's text, which he normally doesn't. So therefore, this is interesting. It's, in other words, that the people, those who had too much land, decided to give it up for the sake of peace, to make peace. Further, as all aristocratic regimes have an oligarchic character, the notables tend to aggrandize themselves, even in Sparta, for example. Properties are always coming into the hands of fewer persons. Um, Again, this is in chapter 2, his criticism. Remember, to go back to his very much criticisms of Sparta about this, how the Spartan regime was explicitly oligarchic, because the senators controlled who'd get the property, and the property increasingly became in the fewer and fewer and fewer, and the ones who couldn't participate to the common meals, couldn't pay their share to the meals, couldn't participate in the regime. So this is the flaw of the so-called finely run Sparta. And this is the problem of aristocratic regime in that sense also, that this failure to understand this. This is why. So therefore, aristocratic regimes have an oligarch character, he says, that they tend to aggrandize themselves, and particularly in property. It it is also open to the notables to the extent to do whatever they wish and connect themselves by marriage with whom they wish. Hence, the city of the location suffered as a result of marriage connections with Dionysus, something that would not have happened in a democracy or an aristocracy that had been well mixed. The reference to is to the tyranny exercised by the Loci in southern Italy during the 350s by Dionysus the Younger, son of Dionysus the Elder of Syracuse, and a Locrian woman. So, in other words, what happened was that a Locrian woman married into the Dionysus family. The younger Dionysus came in and did this. Now, if this was a democracy, or better, where people had some more say, uh, uh, they would not have welcomed Dionysus. This marriage would never have been allowed. So this oligarchy made themselves more, So therefore, this is a good example of this idea of how the regime, because it fails to do this, it becomes more strict. By associating itself with Dionysius, the family did this, and this became powerful, and they closed the regime more dynastic. Right? It became tyrannical in character. And if this was happened to be a democracy, if it was or an aristocracy, this would never have been allowed. Now we go at paragraph 11 here. Change, metabole, revolutions in aristocracies are particularly apt to be overlooked because they are overturned by small steps. Now, a point made in the earlier discourses, universe with respect to all regimes, that even a small thing can be the cause of great revolution. Okay? Again, this is the last phrase that goes up, in chapter 3, in book, and later gloss in 310. That the small things become the big things, right? Here, small changes happen; they become slow, and that small things can cause a revolution. In other words, the small things can trigger the revolution. They're not, in other words, it's big things that really cause that energize things, but it's the small things that can trigger it and do things, right? Let's go back. Let's go. Let's go look at small things. I want to say it is at 4, right? This is at 4. This is the beginning of the whole, right? That famous pun. Half is the beginning of the whole, right? That pun he talked about there. Um, the small things are the things that will cause the greatest problems in that sense because they're trivia. They're not seen as important. They're not seen as significant, and because they're not seen that way, they are ignored. And when it's too late, it's all when it's unfixable, then it's too late to do anything about it. For once they abandon everything of what pertains to the regime, after this it is easier to effect another and slightly greater change until they change the entire order. So in other words, once they abandon what pertains to the regime, so therefore the small change, they overlook the small steps, and then what is that? And then that those small steps are changing what really matters to the regime in question. And then then once that is done away with or lost or forgotten, or where they abandon anything that what pertains to the regime, right? After it is easier to effect another change and slightly greater change until they change the entire order. This too happened in the case of the regime at Thurii. Now, the Thurii one is a very interesting case because he gives two accounts of the same problem, and they do different ways, right? This is the abandoning the regime of small things. There being a law that only one could be a general only at 5-year intervals. Some of the younger men who had become expert in war and developed a reputation with the multitude of garrison troops, holding in contempt those who were in charge of the affairs, considering it an easy matter to prevail over them, undertook first of all to overturn this law so that it would be open to the same person to be general continuously, since they saw that the people would eagerly vote them in. Those of the officials who were charged with this, the so-called consulars, set out at first to oppose this, but when they were then persuaded, as they supposed, that once those had changed this law, they would leave the rest of the regime alone. They didn't. Okay. Yet later, when they wanted to prevent things from being changed, they were no longer able to do anything more. The entire arrangement of the regime underwent a change, becoming the rule of the powerful, of those who had attempted subversion. Now, he says nothing known of these events, and then goes book 7, 9. I would argue that he does it again. He goes back here. This is again right here. What's happening here? This is in chapter 7, 7, 9. This is again another version of this, right? So what happened? is that these garrisons, the people who held the garrisons, and these people, they became powerful, and they sent to do this, and the people resented them, and they probably grabbed the more land on it. Right, that's what happened. This is that thing, and the garrisons. In other words, but the people were trained for war, nevertheless. Again, that's the thing that defined them. Until those who had more of their share of land gave their. That's how the context ends. But here, this led to a civil war. The notables were operating from the garrison, and therefore the strong ones, these military leaders, these things, this became few, and that therefore they sought to aggrandize themselves, make them more and more powerful, and the people responded to them. Okay, so that's how this is the second account of Thurai in the same chapter, and we get different understanding of how the revolution happened. That we see the larger effect of it, how it began. It began because of the neglect of small things, the neglect of small things, of the rule about you can't be a general more than twice, term limits, right? And so no, they held in contempt the people who ran it, and I was ambitious young men, ambitious leaders. They wanted to be more in charge, and they had reputations. So people said, okay, we'll let them do it. They had a reputation of being a good leader, but then what happened was that this led to a problem of the regime not liking it. In other words, and that led to them establishing, they became the power holders. And then there was any attempt then to stop or restrain it. Now gave them the power. They became a dynastic. They became the dynastic. Those leaders in their garrisons, and then that turned the people against them. That's they decided to take more and more land. Right. It was supposed to be open to more people. Right. The argument was, but instead these powerful people decided to get more and more land, making themselves more and more powerful, and that therefore this is how the Civil War happened. Right. Um, So we end with the second account of Therai. Now he continues at 14, which ends the chapter. All regimes are overturned sometimes from within themselves and sometimes from outside. When the opposite sort of regime is nearby or far away but powerful, right? So therefore, you can have regimes can also. Now, this is interesting. They can change from internal. Now this is a more general account. They can change from within or from external sources. This brief thing is going to talk about external sources of all revolutions. If there's some change within the regime, which we talked about, but now outside sources, they are from outside. When the opposite sort of regime is either nearby or far away but powerful. This is what happened in the case of the Athenians and the Spartans. The Athenians overthrew oligarchies everywhere, and the Spartans democracies. This is 73. The reference is the Peloponnesian War, right? But then remember what happened with Athens. Athens decides to go to Syracuse. Syracuse was a kind of democracy, right? It was a democratic government, or at least there was a problem with it, right? And that's why that's odd in that sense. But the rule was that Athens tended to create democracies, and Sparta tended to create oligarchies. Where revolutions and regimes come from then, where revolutions or change in regimes come from, then and factional conflict stasis has been. So he ends the discussion of where how change and stasis emerges, and here this is the ending of this thing. So notice we don't get two chapters. We don't get a chapter of aristocracy. We don't get a chapter on regimes. Regimes and oligarchy, aristocracy is dumped in together. We don't get an account of tyranny. Notice that too. He stops it here. So that's interesting. And what happens in this chapter is this blurring of what politeia regime called regime, or the so-called polity translated by Lord and everyone else, and aristocracy, the so-called aristocracy, was held to be aristocracy. These are really more interconnected, whether the people are more dominant or which is makes it more politeia, or if it is the few are dominating, more oligarchic. and that's aristocracy. And therefore, this is very interesting. Now, he talks about the external forces of this, and that how one regime will, a very powerful regime next to it, and a regime next to it is going to try to influence it towards be like itself. If it's a very powerful regime far away, and the example of this was Athens and Sparta, and the way it do this. Now, and this ends the discussion of change, the factional conflict, and the cause of change, Matabale. With that, we'll stop here. If you have any questions, put the questions below. Comments, questions, whatever. Um, if you liked it, like it, share it with a friend, share it on social media, share it around. If you've not subscribed, do subscribe. Get a friend to subscribe, grow the channel a little bit. Show them this one item, the other lectures in the series, and all the other series I've done as well. If you didn't like it, you can say no, but say why, in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media, the information is below. If you want to help, there's a way to do that. Patreon, subscribe star. Okay, yes, I'm not really active in it, and it's like this. It is doing things. You're going to hear me less talk about this. I think I made a mistake about something, but I fixed it. I think. It would be helpful. Expensive life is expensive. Inflation is going high. It would be nice. Less and less money. I have more books to buy. Books are more expensive. Another way you can help is by buying my book. You can buy this by Lulu, a notebook on Aristotle's politics. It is not a commentary or interpretation. It is a kind of a study guide. I wrote this last August. It was published. It's basically designed as a study guide for students and people studying the politics to go through it. It has guides and charts of the various, all through the politics, kind of guide you through it. It's like Cliff's Notes, right? And it is very useful. Now, if you buy it at Lulu, you can get it at Amazon, but I get less money if you get it at Amazon. If you buy it at Lulu, I get what Amazon makes. So, but the problem is Amazon maybe send it to you free, and Hulu makes you pay. So please go get this. It would be useful if you want to help. If you know a student or someone studying the politics, and it might be useful for them. Okay, that's it. Next chapter will be chapter 8, where we discuss preservation and how to preserve regimes, which is done in 8 and 9, which is very interesting. We don't get a discussion of. He says he's going to have a general account and then a very specific concept of how to preserve regimes. This is that weird thing here. Now I will stop here. Take care and have a nice day.